All right, I think it's time for us to start. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on SuDS implementation for thriving biodiversity. My name is Adrian Bodremont and I'm a senior research manager at Syria. And I will be chairing this webinar. But before we start, let's go over a few housekeeping points. So here you go. I think we all know how it works now. This is a Zoom meeting, so you have the opportunity to put some questions in the Q&A box. If you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat, and someone from our team will try to help you out if you have any issues with sound or video. The meeting is being recorded. We do share the links of our recordings for people to access after the meeting is completed. You are in listen mode, listen only mode. And if you have any other type of questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. If you want to share resources, you can do so in the chat as well. And we will do the same. Whenever we mention some documents, we will put the URL in the chat. If you want to talk about this in your social media, feel free to do so. There is a few hashtags here on the screen that you can use or referencing for LinkedIn. Feel free to do so. And we are aiming to finish around 12. So I'm going to pass through those slides. So you can see here, you can raise your hand as well, Q&A box. And then, of course, if you see a question that you want to support, that you like, feel free to do so. That will help us later on when we go through the questions to prioritize those. Moving through the slides. All right, a little bit of information about Syria, the Construction Industry Research and Information Association. We've been around for more than 60 years now, and our key principles are to work in collaboration, to deliver good practice, knowledge transfer, and to improving capacity and capabilities. So we are a not-for-profit member-led organization, and we are known for our collaborative approach, independent stance, and our outputs are very well regarded within the construction industry in the UK and beyond. And in terms of those outputs, you might be familiar with the guidance documents that we publish on a regular basis. We do those on different themes. The ones that are interesting us today are biodiversity within the built environment, and also, of course, sustainable drainage systems. So this is one type of output. We also provide trainings for the industry, and those trainings are based on our guidance documents. So we have a whole series of them on SuDS, for example, which are derived from the SuDS manual. We do also have a series of communities, and this webinar today is very much relevant to, sorry, before I go there, this is the slides from our membership, Syria membership. So we are really proud of this. We cover pretty much the whole spectrum from academia to designing, constructing, and maintaining infrastructure in the built environment. So you can see probably some of you are here on the call, and we're really, really grateful for that. So as I mentioned, we do have a series of communities of practice, which are member-based as well, but they are focusing on a much fine-grained topic. So one of them is around biodiversity, and we organize biodiversity awards every year. So we are really, really proud to have the members here on screen. This is thanks to your support that we can have that we can organize this type of event. So thank you so much for being a member of this. This is really a forum for discussing everything related to biodiversity, to share knowledge and good practice, and also to be cited on the latest in terms of innovation and good practice. The second one is SuDS, Committee for Sustainable Drainage. It is also a SIRIA committee of practice, which share the same purposes, which is to provide a knowledge platform to share case studies and to really have this networking opportunity for all the members to get together on a regular basis to exchange what works, what does not, and how the industry can improve. We do have the SuDS Awards as well. So this year we are celebrating SuDS projects, and we have a lot of information on that on sudsdrain.org. This is our SuDS membership. It's a very dynamic group, and we're really proud to have all the designers and implementers, all the main stakeholders pretty much involved with the design, implementation, and monitoring of sustainable drainage systems. All right, I think that was my very quick 5-minute introductions. We have a lot to cover today. It's a very packed webinar, and there's a lot of really good information here. And I'm delighted to be joined today by our 4 speakers. Each of them will cover a different aspect of how we can make SuDS and biodiversity work and support each other. So we will hear from Craig McAdam from BugLife on principles for biodiversity within SuDS. Then we will dive into 2 ongoing research projects, one from Andrara Opris, which will be focusing on pollinators, one from Christy MacArthur, which will be focusing on invertebrates. And then we will hear from Rachel Glossop about the practical applications of mixing, merging, and leveraging SuDS and biodiversity for your urban project. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And here we go. I will pass it on now to Craig McAdam, co-leader and director of conservation for BugLife. His bio will be posted in the chat box, and very much looking forward to that presentation. So, Craig, all yours.
Thank you, Adrian. And thank you for inviting me to present here today. Just trying to get my slides to move on. There we go. My name's Craig McAdam, as Adrian said, and I'm co-leader and director of conservation at BugLife, the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. For those of you that haven't heard of BugLife before, we are the only organisation in Europe concerned with the conservation of all invertebrates. From spiders to starfish, mayflies to millipedes, we undertake practical action, raise awareness of invertebrates and their habitats, and provide a voice for invertebrates through our advocacy work. Our aim is to halt invertebrate extinctions and to achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates. Now, before I move on, I've got a confession to make. Whilst I've been studying invertebrates for 35 years, I actually originally trained as a civil engineer and worked for 4 years in the water industry in Scotland, designing drainage systems. So this was back in the late 1990s, and at that time, SuDS were just coming in to be used for surface water management in Scotland, and I was involved in the design of some of these. So some of my criticisms that come up later on, I've lived them, as it were. So today I'm going to be talking about how we manage surface water in the UK. And to give some context, I thought it would be useful to look at the climate that we're living in. We all know that Britain is famous for its rain, but this climate data here, which is the latest climate data, shows that we're getting milder, wetter winters, so more rain in the winter. And of course, we need to then manage that surface water. This means we're going to see more views like this, flooding in areas, but making sure that new developments are sited in the right location, for example, not on floodplains like this photo shows here, and ensuring that surface water is managed correctly are absolutely essential. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the use of sustainable urban drainage systems and developments and how we can make them better, work better for wildlife as well. So let's start off with what SuDS are. SuDS are sustainable urban drainage systems that manage surface water by mimicking natural processes. They can take many different forms. For example, green roofs and living roofs that slow the flow of water into the drainage system. Green walls, green swales, grass filter strips, detention basins, small constructed wetlands, or small-scale modular features, often called rain gardens. And these can either be used in isolation or they can be used in combination to create a process of treatment. The functions of a SuDS can be described using the SuDS triangle, and SuDS have four functions: to slow the flow of surface water by reducing the quantity of water flowing to rivers in times of flood, to remove pollutants from surface water before it enters a watercourse, and to remove amenity by creating and sustaining better places for people, and delivering biodiversity benefits by creating and sustaining better places for nature. The first two functions are engineering functions. The third is a placemaking function, and the fourth is an ecological function. So one of my questions is, why aren't ecologists involved in the design of these features? Taking that fourth function and looking more closely at the ecological considerations, we can use a different type of triangle, the habitats triangle. A good habitat for insects and other wildlife will have somewhere that the species can breed, somewhere where adults and young can shelter, and have food for both the adults and the young, as this is often different, as we'll perhaps see later on. Okay, let's have a look at some SuDS. So the first example is just close to my house here in Bannockburn in Stirling, as a dry detention or attenuation basin. Most people would think this was a park, and if it flooded, they'd probably get in touch with the local authority and complain. However, if you look closely at the area, there are three pipes leading from a surface water pumping station into this area of grassland. If the pumping station is overwhelmed, it will overflow into this area where the water will either evaporate or soak into the ground. If the flow is significant, there's an overflow on the other side. On the other side of the area where the water can flow out and back into the system. So this SuDS ticks the water quantity box. It manages water flow in times of flood, but it's an ecological desert. Closely mown grass, no shelter, no flowers as food plants for insects. Here's another detention basin, this time a wet one in Falkirk at the Falkirk Stadium. You can see that it's an engineering structure by the straight lines and the liberal use of gabion baskets. If the reeds and bulrush hadn't started to establish here, this would effectively resemble an Olympic-sized swimming pool with no features for wildlife. Here's another detention basin in Carron. The engineering is prominently on show again here. This is during the construction. It has matured a little since then, but you can still see the engineering structures, but there's little consideration for ecology in the design. This is getting a bit better, starting to look nice. It's got the amenity feel. It's got that village pond sort of a feel. And it's a detention basin again with scalloped sides, some marginal vegetation, and relatively flat sloping sides. It's visually appealing and provides habitat for the larval stages of aquatic insects such as hoverflies. But there's no flowers here for them to feed upon, so it's not going to be as successful as a site which provides all the stages for its life cycle. Here's another detention basin in Kinnaird Village in the central belt of Scotland. Just look at the steep sides of this. This has definitely been designed by an engineer. This photo was taken in 2008 when they were constructing the village. If we fast forward to 2025 and 17 years later, the pond has matured. It's got marginal vegetation, but the water is deep. the sides are steep, and this will exclude many invertebrates and amphibians, as we'll see later on. Before we move on to some better examples of SuDS, I want to talk about management of SuDS. This is a particularly bad example of management. That too many of these sites are managed by exception. This is a good example of that. The grounds maintenance team in this estate have cut the banks of the SuDS to within an inch of their life. Very short grass, very short sward. But there's a swan here, and it's on a nest, so we can't disturb the swan. So what they've done is they've just leave that bit uncut. We shouldn't have to have a swan on a nest to manage for wildlife. We should be doing that as a matter of course. Contrast that with this image of a small SuDS at the back of those houses. You can still see that it's an engineering structure. It's got those handrails in the bottom right corner of the picture. But this one is managed more sympathetically for wildlife. There are bulrushes and other emergent aquatic plants in the basin, and the surrounds have flowering plants such as knapweed, thistle, ragwort, which are perfect for pollinators. Of course, this SuDS is going to need maintenance. It's going to need some of that vegetation cleared out to prevent it from succeeding over to woodland and to maintain the function of the SuDS. But that can be done in a sympathetic fashion as well by doing it in a piecemeal fashion, maybe a third of the pond every year. Here's another SuDS in the same estate. Whilst it's a bit too circular, there is a mix of vegetation here. It's got deep and shallow areas, and it's got fairly shallow sloping shores. There's emergent and floating vegetation in the pond itself, providing a variety of places for wildlife to shelter. But it still has short mown grass around it. Where are the flowers? There's no food here for pollinators. I'd like to finish with an example in Grangemouth, which I think is a good example of a SuDS design. This is a rain garden in Setland Park in Grangemouth, which slows the flow of the surface water to the Grange Burn. And the Grange Burn has an issue with flooding in the town. It's located in an old rose garden in the corner of the park and comprises a gravel channel, which has been planted up with a variety of water-loving plants and nectar sources. It's not only effective at managing surface water, it's attractive too. And even when the rain garden is dry, it's busy with bees and butterflies and birds. But most importantly, there's interpretation here to explain to visitors what's happening and why it's important. None of the other examples I've shown in this talk have had any interpretation. They're all fenced off, out of bounds, stay away. And that's because they're managed as engineering structures. Here instead, they explain the engineering and show how important nature-based solutions are to mitigating the effects of a changing climate. So going back to my first example of the detention pond in Bannockburn, this is mown on a regular basis, probably every fortnight, and it's an urban desert. It holds very little value for wildlife. Why couldn't it be like this example of a meadow that was created in Bo'ness on a similar piece of grassland? This was created by BugLife as part of the Inner Forth project, and this is the first year of annual flowering. It then went into a perennial phase and continued. Or what about this area that we created in Camelin, created through the Pollinator Way project? These areas still need managed, but instead of fortnightly mowing to maintain a short sward, these areas are managed as grasslands. There's a spring and autumn cut taken from these, and all the arisings, all the cuttings are removed from the site. It cut down on the management costs, creates a more visually appealing area, and produces food and shelter for pollinators and other wildlife. So to summarise, SuDS are important blue-green features in urban areas, but it's important to design biodiversity in from the start to ensure that they provide the habitat and resources for all stages of the life cycle of insects and other wildlife. Importantly, The grassy areas of these SuDS should be maintained as grassland. That's what they are, with cutting once or twice a year and the risings removed from the site. Engineering structures such as inlets and overflows, etc., can be trimmed or cleaned more often. It's important to provide interpretation at these sites to explain what they are, to explain why they're being managed as they are, and to dissuade homeowners from pouring oils, detergents, etc., down the surface drains and ending up in these places. Finally, you should enjoy them. Enjoy the dragonflies and damselflies hunting around the surface. Enjoy the butterflies flitting from flower to flower, or enjoy the evening dance of mayflies over the water. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. Great presentation. Lots of good and not so good examples of SuDS and how to design them for biodiversity. You mentioned something that is very something that we are trying to convey as much as possible is the importance of considering all the aspects of SuDS, which of course includes biodiversity, from the earlier stages of any project to really make sure that the design takes into account those key components and that they are not left at the very last minute. So thank you so much, Craig. All right, we are going to hear from our second speaker. And our second speaker is Andrada Opris, a researcher from the Edinburgh Napier University. Andrada, all yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So just a quick intro to myself and the project. My name is Andrada. I am a PhD student at Edinburgh Napier University, and my PhD project aims to look at what type of ecosystem services or habitat support can SuDS provide for pollinators. So a bit of a background in pollinators themselves. We know globally that changes in land use and that climate-induced shifts in phenology, those are the main drivers of pollinator declines globally. And of course, they have the potential to significantly impact our food security by altering the way insects provide ecosystem services like pollination. So as a response, the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the Pollinator Strategy for Scotland, they recognize these threats and they urge action to help restore natural habitats, to reduce pesticide use, and to integrate invertebrate conservation measures into urban areas, but also agricultural areas. But I'm sure, as you're aware, a lot of this action and research has focused on bees, but amongst prominent non-bee pollinators are actually hoverflies. So hoverflies or flower flies, their family Syrphidae. Just for context, we have about 300 species in Britain, and they pollinate about 72% of our global food crops, important pollinators. But of course, besides pollination, they provide other ecosystem services that bees don't. For example, natural pest control or nutrient cycling, and also long-distance pollen transfer, which of course has implications for plant genetic diversity and our food security ultimately. So while the adults rely heavily on floral resources like nectar and pollen from flowers, they have high diversity at the larval stage as well, with some of the larvae feeding on plant matter, on fungi matter, some larvae feeding on animal matter, and some larvae feeding on that decaying vegetation organic matter. So I want to draw particular attention to hoverflies with aquatic larval stages. I've got the dragonfly here on screen, the adult and the larvae. So the larvae, they're called the rat-tailed maggots because of this long appendage they used to breathe underwater. So they feed on decaying vegetation matter in compost heaps, in manure piles, and just generally disgusting stagnant waters. And that's where SuDS come in. So when we think about the urbanized landscape, we generally think of it as homogenized, species poor, but we know that well-managed habitats can actually provide high diversity for invertebrates, and especially for well-managed freshwater systems, even in an urban context. So I'm not going too much into depth with SuDS. Everyone is familiar with the design, with the SuDS triangle, but I want to highlight, of course, the biodiversity and amenity aspect here being the most overlooked and understudied. So the government, of course, is mandating SuDS in Scotland for every new development. And we recognize this water management role of the SuDS, of course, with pollution retention and absorption and flood risk management, but we don't quite understand the biodiversity benefits that they might provide. And very often they're not delivering the benefits they promise. So that's where my project comes in. Just to show you some pictures, I've sampled 50 retention basins, SuDS, around the central belt of Scotland. And I just noticed I've got a picture here that Craig showed as well. So just to highlight some of the diversity with my sample locations. So I've got temporarily wet or permanently wet. You can notice the different emergent vegetation here, different marginal vegetation. And I've sampled 50 of these over 2 years. I've sampled 3 rounds in spring, early summer and late summer. And just showing you some of the life that's happening around the SuDS ponds without us noticing, essentially. So very high diversity for hoverflies. There's roundworms using the leaf litter. There's spiders, of course, amphibians using the site, and lots of dragonflies and damselflies. So I wanted to understand, on one hand, what do pollinators need at a local scale, but also what makes a SuDS well placed into the landscape to add that real biodiversity value. So of course, you can imagine it means lots of variables. At the landscape scale, it means, for example, the percentage of different land covers within a buffer that's relevant for pollinators. So I've looked at the percentage of urban cover in 500 meters or the percentage of arable land in 5 kilometers around the SuD. But it's also about understanding the SuDS design itself. So I've measured things like depth, the bank slopes, surface area, whether there's waterfowl pollution from ducks and swans and so on. And of course, things to do with floral resources at the site. So floral richness, floral units, the water surface vegetation cover. And in reality, a lot of these factors might interact before they impact my pollinator abundance and my pollinator richness. So instead of using linear models, which get too complicated, too many variables, I chose to use structural equation models, or SEMs. And that's because they allow different relationships to be specified a priori based on ecological knowledge. And they can actually distinguish between direct and indirect effects. So for example, and this is just one example pathway that I've included, we know that, for example, at the bottom, I've got floral richness. They probably positively influence pollinator abundance, but we know that floral richness itself is negatively influenced by the surrounding arable land. And we also know that it increases with SuDS surface area. So the bigger the SuDS, the more likely I am to find more flowers. So just to show you some preliminary results from my PhD, this is a work in progress. And I know the diagram is complicated, but I'll walk you through some interesting pathways. So I've highlighted here the floral richness as a positive driver. It was a positive impact on pollinator abundance. And at the landscape level, it was things like the broadleaf woodland and the heather in 5 kilometers that positively influenced my pollinator richness, as did the SuDS bank slope. So I think this pattern is quite interesting. As I'm separating the analysis for hoverflies and for bees, it might be revealed that it's bees that are actually driving this variation, this effect, because many species of bees are using this south-facing bank slope for nesting in the soil. I've also found the water surface vegetation cover to be a positive driver of pollinator richness. So I suspect that's specifically driven with by hoverflies with aquatic larval stages that I've mentioned before. These rat-tailed maggots prefer water bodies that are rich in organic matter. So that increased vegetation cover may actually enhance habitat suitability and contributes ultimately to my species richness. So of course the model also highlighted this indirect link with waterfowl. So that's waterfall pollution negatively affecting this surface vegetation cover. And that's likely due to the nutrient input, excess nutrients like nitrogen especially, which can reduce the suitability for aquatic plants. One last thing I wanted to highlight from my preliminary results is the plant species driving the pollinator community. So the strongest influences came from bramble, oxeye daisy, red clover, and knapweed. And these are all very, very nectar-rich, highly valuable to pollinators, but they're often labeled as weeds due to our human bias. And other flowers were important too, like buttercups, thistles, and rugworts, like Craig said. They're often deemed undesirable in the Weeds Act, of course. But this is particularly relevant here in Scotland, as Scotland is developing its own equivalent of the BNG, of the Biodiversity Net Gain, and it's important that habitats are not penalized for containing species that are, although sometimes classified as weeds, they can actually contribute substantial nectar to the local scale for pollinators. So, impact of the project, I'm hoping that the finding will inform the pollinator strategy for Scotland and inform strategic intervention projects. I also plan to integrate the SuDS into these existing habitat networks for pollinators, such as the beeline schemes from BugLife. And I'll also be providing the land managers and developers with a technical report of what works best for designing SuDS for pollinators. And just to briefly mention, I'm not going to get into it too much due to time, but just to mention what's possible to do for insect research at this SuDS, it's quite fascinating. So I'm looking to see if we can use molecular techniques like eDNA to improve monitoring of hoverflies with aquatic larval stages. You can see some of the rat-tailed maggots here. But also looking at pathways of heavy metal contamination from SuDS sediment into the flowers growing around the SuDS and ultimately into pollinator tissue itself. So of course, part of the SuDS main role is to absorb pollution. So finding heavy metals or high heavy metal concentrations in sediment is expected, but we don't necessarily understand if these metals actually transfer up the food chain to animals, in which case SuDS might act as an ecological trap for wildlife that are using them for habitat. So different management forms would be needed for that. But that's me. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks a lot. Great presentation, Andrada. We have just a few minutes here before we pass on to the next speaker. Just a quick question that popped up in the chat box. Well, you mentioned the slopes as being a factor for pollinators. Which one are we talking about? Is it better when it's steep? Is it better when it's, what's the actual profile that is best?
Yeah. So as always, I would suggest is having that structural heterogeneity. So just having a mosaic of microhabitats that the insects can use as, like Craig said, breeding grounds and nesting, but also feeding resources. So the south-facing bank slope is used specifically by bees, by nesting bees, but not only. Many invertebrates are using it as a resting site. Bare ground, areas of bare ground should be used and incorporated in the design stage, quite low cost, but they are not often used because of the amenity aspect. It's undesirable. It's giving that untidy aesthetic, but like I said, a lot of invertebrates do rely on these micro features that often go unnoticed by us, but they provide nesting and breeding habitat and are important for inverts.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this response. Just a little hint to an upcoming webinar that we're organizing on microhabitats, which will be all about this. Thank you, Andrada. Now, we are going to hear from our next speaker, Kirsty MacArthur, research scientist from the Edinburgh Napier University. So if you want to put your camera on, and the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirsty MacArthur and I'm a final year PhD student at Edinburgh Napier University, and I'll be talking to you today about some of my findings from my research. So yeah, I'll be talking to you about the research I've been doing on amphibian and invertebrate communities in SuDS ponds. Next slide, please. So ponds are lentic water bodies anywhere from 50 meters squared all the way up to 2 hectares, and they are hotspots for biodiversity. Urbanization and expansion of agricultural areas has historically caused huge declines in the number of ponds in the landscape. And extensive management and modification of freshwater systems for human use continues to drive substantial freshwater biodiversity loss. And this is occurring at a more rapid rate than in marine or terrestrial systems. Next slide, please. Urbanization has particularly damaging effects on biodiversity due to the fragmentation of habitats, which can be particularly devastating for freshwater species that rely on connected waterways. Next slide. In addition to their water management functions, SuDS ponds can be highly beneficial for freshwater species as they can provide a replacement or supplement to natural habitats, and in particular act as stepping stones through inhospitable urban environments. Next slide. So my aim was to identify key SuDS features which influence freshwater biodiversity. So I selected 82 sites across Scotland. I only included permanently wet features which were at least 5 years old to reduce any bias from pond drying or planting strategy. And at each site, I conducted amphibian surveys, collected freshwater invertebrate samples, and I measured a series of pond-specific and landscape variables to cover as many potentially important SuDS characteristics as possible at as wide a scale as possible. Next slide. So the main focus for my PhD so far has been on amphibian communities. In Scotland, we have 6 native amphibian species, 4 of which are readily found in SuDS ponds. Next slide. These are the common frog, the common toad, the palmate newt, and the smooth newt. Great crested newt and the non-native alpine newt have also been recorded in SuDS, but this is a bit less common, and I have not recorded any in this study. Amphibians are a global conservation concern, with habitat loss and fragmentation being one of the major threats. The requirement for both freshwater and terrestrial habitat can make their use of urban areas particularly challenging. Next slide. So firstly, just to summarize some of the results, common frog and palmate newt were recorded most often, followed by common toad and smooth newt. Aberdeen and Inverness sites are out with the typical range of smooth newt, so the occupancy here is calculated for the central belt sites. When measuring the water quality, we can see that most of the SuDS ponds were within clean water levels for nitrate and phosphate, based on Freshwater Habitats Trust guidelines. However, this is just one aspect. So I also looked at the Habitat Suitability Index, next slide, which we can see isn't looking particularly great. This was developed specifically for great crested newt, but it does give us a good idea for the general habitat quality of for all of the amphibians. So on the left is the baseline assessment. This includes things like pond area, macrophyte cover, and impact from birds and fish. And on the right, I've adjusted this to include bank slope, because of course, a lot of these SuDS have very steep sides, and that can be very difficult for amphibians to use. And I've also included things like mowing regime and planting strategy of the area directly surrounding the pond. So you can see that that does push things more into the poor and below average category. Based on this, there is a lot that we can do to hopefully improve these sites for amphibians. Next slide. To conduct a more in-depth analysis, I used a GP boost model. So this combines tree boosting with Gaussian processes. The tree boosting iteratively splits ponds into similar groups based on the explanatory variables, combining multiple different iterations. So in this case, I used 1,000 to create more robust predictions. Next slide, please. The Gaussian process component simultaneously handles the random effects, so that allows us to control for things like repeated sampling and site clustering, resulting in an importance score for each of the variables, highlighting which factors most strongly influence the probability of amphibian presence. Next slide, please. So from each of the individual analyses, we get 5 key variables which were common amongst species. Next slide, please. So the first is conductivity. This is a measurement of the number of ions in the water column. So this is a very, very crude measurement of pollution. And we can see that mostly for the species here, it is negative, but it's actually at a lower level than we might be expecting. So for the newt species in particular, this is kind of having a decrease at around 200 microsieverts. For reference, drinking water can be 800 to 1,000 microsieverts. So this is very, very low. And I think this is more to do with the specific ions that are driving that higher biodiversity, higher conductivity, rather than just the ions in general. Next slide, please. So the second is road length. This is quite understandable. Roads are typically very dangerous for amphibians. There's direct mortality from vehicle collisions, and they can also get trapped in gully pot drains on the sides of roads. There's also that link to pollution, and it acts as a very strong barrier to dispersal for most amphibian species. Next slide, please. The vegetation that we're seeing here for submerged vegetation and emergent vegetation, there's some species-specific preferences. That big drop in emergent vegetation for the toads is probably to do with their preference for more open, deeper habitats, so that a small amount of vegetation can kind of limit their movement in the pond. Next slide, please. And lastly, we see linear water features being really positive. So that's things like canals, rivers, and streams. And while they do provide some navigation potential for the toads, I think also these are generally well connected in urban areas to other green spaces. They have some damp areas, and generally they're very quiet at night. That makes them an ideal amphibian highway. So these could potentially be really important for amphibian movement in cities. Next slide. There are, of course, a lot more species-specific responses, and this slide shows the top 10 most important variables for each species. And we can see some general patterns starting to emerge. So the frogs and the toads, we're seeing water chemistry and pond vegetation variables being important. And when we look at the newts, we see palmate newt in the blue being driven much more by the pond variables and less by the landscape, whereas for smooth newt, the opposite is true. So we do know that smooth are more generalist. They don't mind too much what the pond looks like, but they do prefer them to be more clustered, closer together, and those terrestrial habitats being really important. Whereas maybe for palmate newt, they're more willing to travel to find the right pond. Next slide. Just to highlight some of the species-specific variables, we can see that the blue and the green land cover have a really positive impact, particularly for the frogs and the smooth newt. In general, these will provide important habitat for amphibians during the terrestrial phase of their life cycle. Next slide, please. We also see some more interesting effects with the water chemistry. So we're seeing generally negative impacts of these nutrients, and that interesting effect with pH. A lot of these nutrients, particularly ammonium, will have certain pH ranges where they become ammonia, which is a bit more toxic, and that's what we're seeing with that frog dip at around 8 to 8.5 there. Next slide, please. Just to mention specifically palmate newt, next slide. We're also seeing overwhelmingly the driver for them is stickleback presence. So these are small predatory fish which are highly aggressive and very territorial, and they compete with the adult newts for space and resources, as well as eating the eggs and the larvae. Next slide, please. So this desire to be away from these fish might also link to their preference for smaller ponds and slightly less well-connected ponds, because that is typically more encouraging to fish. So next slide, please. Overall, this paints quite a nice picture of the amphibian community preferences when it comes to SuDS ponds. Next slide, please. I have also been looking at the invertebrate community in SuDS ponds. So invertebrates underpin food webs, they help with nutrient cycling and productivity, and the community composition can also be quite useful for an indicator of pond health. Invertebrates are heavily impacted by urbanization, with urban areas tending to favor the highly tolerant generalist species, resulting in diminished community richness. The invertebrate analysis is currently in the very preliminary stage, and I want to stress that the figures you're about to see are based not on a complete set of species, as identification is ongoing, but it is analysing the species richness as it is. And I wanted to give an idea of the kinds of variables that might become important. Next slide, please. So these results are showing us that the nutrient variables are having a negative effect, particularly at those higher ends. Next slide. So that brings us a bit back to the slide I showed previously with the majority of the ponds being clean water, but those sites that are a little bit more polluted in that low or high pollution categories might need a bit more attention. Next slide. Yeah, so you can see in those upper ends, that might be what is having that negative effect on these communities. Next slide. We do also see some positive trends. So next slide. Yeah, some of these, like the pasture land cover and the grassland, so the surrounding area having green cover, as well as within the pond, that floating vegetation having a positive effect. Next slide. And interestingly, we also see negative impacts of heavy metals in the sediment, in this case, the lead and the chromium concentrations. So this is something that wasn't really having a clear effect on the amphibian community, but may have a stronger effect on invertebrates, especially those which are living in the sediment. Next slide. So looking more closely at the sediments, we can see the overall picture is a little bit alarming. So you can see the horizontal lines on the figures. The lower one in orange is the threshold effect concentration, below which it's not expected there will be any effect on sediment-dwelling organisms. And the red line is the probable effect concentration. So above that, it is expected that there will be an effect. So you can see that most of them are above that threshold, and many of them are above that probable effect concentration. So this highlights a particular concern about the design and maintenance of SuDS systems and the potential to create these toxic sinks, as the heavy metals and a lot of other pollutants settle into or bind to that sediment. It's not routinely monitored, so the water quality could look really good, but this is hidden underneath and can really easily be resuspended and re-enter that water column. Next slide, please. So that leads us to the question of what can we do with all of this information? There's a few SuDS design or management features which we might be able to target to really maximize their biodiversity benefits. Roads were of course detrimental, but they're really difficult to avoid with SuDS, but we might look at positioning within the development or mitigation structures like tunnels and green bridges, and avoiding gully pots to prevent any amphibian entrapment. The vegetation, along with other pond species-specific pond habitat features, could be managed specifically for known populations or just in general in the environment to have a variety of different types of habitat. We also know that good landscape connectivity results in more healthy populations. So making sure that we're considering different habitats and different developments in the same area to kind of have an increased variety when we're designing SuDS ponds. The pollution levels in each of these ponds were a major concern, so ensuring that there's a well-designed and maintained treatment train of other SuDS features, so things like swales, sediment traps, filter strips, upstream of any pond is crucial to the SuDS design. So allowing that sediment to accumulate directly into the pond reduces the water storage volume, it limits the water treatment capacity, it impacts the biodiversity, and the look and smell of these impacted sites really reduce their amenity value. So a lot of these heavily impacted sites are not really hitting any of the core SuDS aims. And removing that sediment is also really difficult, it's very expensive, and it severely disrupts the habitat. But by designing treatment trains which are simple and more cost effective to maintain, not just 1 or 2 years, but decades into the future, we can have biodiversity more of a focus, and we'll be able to realize more of the full potential of SuDS as a sustainable way to manage that urban runoff. So last slide, please. But yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Kirsty. Really good and interesting conversation. It's great to see the research taking shape and some of the early learnings from it. So thanks a lot for sharing those with us. All right, our last speaker of this morning is Rachel Glossop, Flood Risk Planning Manager at Hull City Council. Rachel, just checking in if you can jump in, and yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So yes, I'm Rachel Glossop. I'm the Flood Risk Planning Manager at Hull City Council, and I wanted to talk to you today about the Biodiversity Net Gain and Sustainable Drainage Systems Toolkit that we've created in Hull. So I'll just go into a bit of detail about what Biodiversity Net Gain is, then why it's so relevant to Hull, and then just give you a bit of a snapshot to get you really excited as to what the toolkit is. So next slide, please, Charlotte. So what is biodiversity net gain? Well, it very simply put, it's development which leaves the biodiversity in a better state than it was before. So typically net loss, which we've seen up till now, has been where you have your habitat, your ecology, you have your development, and you've lost it all. We've then sort of moved on from that, and actually more like we have our sort of baseline habitat, we do our development site, and then we actually compensate for what we've lost. Biodiversity net gain is very simply not only mitigating and compensating for what's lost, but also just providing that 10% increase. So really simple, right? Can you move on, Charlotte? Unfortunately not. So to make this nationally consistent, we have a matrix. Now we've moved on from the matrix that you've seen on here. I can't remember the matrix that we're on now, but when we did the toolkit, it was Biodiversity Matrix 3.1. So the matrix is just to ensure that everybody's measuring habitat as a proxy and doing that in a consistent way so that we all get the same sort of results and we can actually measure what we are delivering. So it uses looking at your site prior to your development. So obviously the size of the site, the distinctiveness of that ecology or habitat that you've got, the condition, which is really important, the strategic significance, such as how does it fit in with like green corridors and things. And that would give you your pre-development biodiversity units. And then you measure the same following your development to assess what your post biodiversity units are, but you also have to factor in those red circles at the bottom, which are things like difficulty to create, because of course many of us in the past have probably had ecology policies in local plans and things that's just like you replace a tree with 3 whips, but the time that it would take those 3 whips to get to that target condition where it's providing that habitat and ecology that mature tree might have taken is decades down the line. So actually this matrix enables you to measure some of those. And the other important factor on this is spatial risk. So that's all about sort of, obviously you're removing habitat or ecology from one place, and the key is trying to recreate that as close as possible to where you're removing it. So there's all these other factors that you have to bring into that matrix. It's not just as simple as like just, right, we've lost 1 tree and we'll provide 2 trees and that gives you your 10%. Next slide. So there are 3 mechanisms for delivering biodiversity net gain. Nationally, there's obviously the first, which is the preferred option, which is on-site. So please don't damage the ecology in the first place, is the plea. Obviously, this is good for when you're thinking about your SuDS, because nearly all development sites will not only require BNG, but they're also going to require SuDS. So if you can use your SuDS features to create your BNG units on-site, then that would be ideal. Off-site units, this is where you're sort of using a habitat bank to create those units that you need to provide your 10% net gain for. So many developments might use a combination of both on-site and off-site, depending on their design. And then there's statutory credits, which I'm not even going to talk about because they're incredibly expensive and they're like the last resort, really. So that's where it's just going into like a central government managed system and you're not really helping any of your local ecology or habitat. Next slide. And if you just do next again, can you, Charlotte, because there's a map. Perfect. So why did we think we needed a toolkit in Hull? So Hull is an incredibly densely populated city with very little green space. The map at the bottom there just shows our boundary. So we're very unique in that we're surrounded only by one other local authority, that's the East Riding, which is quite a rural authority. We've got the Humber Estuary to the south. Because we're so densely populated with a population of around 300,000, every bit of green space we have is having to provide all of those benefits that we want our green spaces to provide. 90% of the city is below the high tide level, so without the whole tidal surge barrier, which you can see on the top photograph, we'd have the tide coming in twice a day. 20% of England's land drains via the Humber Estuary, so we wave to all that water going past us on a daily basis. 84% of surface water from the city drains into the sewer system, and we are 100% reliant on pumping because our topography is that of a bowl. So we've got made land along the Humber frontage and along the watercourses. And that means that water, rainfall falling on the city and the surrounding area, because that also drains through the city, has to be pumped out to get into the estuary. Next slide, please. So all that leads to a very high level of flood risk. And our drainage plan, which looks like a set of worms on this map, just shows all the complexity of the hydrology in the city. You've got yellow lines, which is the Environment Agency main rivers. You've got pink lines, which is all the Yorkshire Water combined sewer system, which is going to one wastewater treatment works to the east of the city, which is the one plug where everything's pumped out. But you've also got lots of brown lines, which is watercourses that were filled in the 1940s and 50s with regeneration. Of course, those watercourses now, all that water that would have gone into those is trying to find its way into a sewer system. So that means there's a massive capacity issue. So for us, SuDS is key. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of SuDS and in terms of biodiversity net gain, there's two things. There's a lot of new development, which obviously we're requiring SuDS and BNG for. And then there's also retrofitting, because we're having to retrofit that blue-green infrastructure, those SuDS, to compensate for decades of development where the city's expanded and we've not thought about all of that water that's got to get into that at-capacity sewer system. So we have a Living with Water 25-year blue-green plan, which is, you can see the little boxes here, which is about using assets we've already got and optimizing those. We can't get away from the fact that we will need some grey infrastructure. We will need pumping stations to get that water out. Managed change is all about trying to, well, it will be, to put it bluntly, demolishing areas of housing and building it back better. But obviously that then gives us the opportunity then to create that more biodiversity net gain, to create that more blue-green infrastructure. Source control, which is retrofit SuDS. Blue-green corridors, so that's about trying to keep water on the surface and convey it through the city, and with people and culture at the heart. So we can't do any of this unless we take communities along with us. So we've got successive asset management plans. That's the water company's investment alongside flood defence grant and aid, local levy, shared prosperity funding and devolution funding to really try and bring that blue-green vision to the city. As I said before, we've got very limited space, so all land needs to work very hard to provide those multiple benefits. Viability is a massive issue in Hull for new development because you've got a very high level of flood risk. 98% of the city is in what's called flood zone 3, which is the high risk. So that means every development in Hull needs to have floodproofing as standard, and that adds to the cost. You've got a lot of contaminated land, and you're generally the prices of the houses that are built are lower than anywhere else nationally. So a lot of development in Hull only happens with a lot of public subsidies. So obviously the viability issue always comes up with developers pushing back against the requirement for SuDS and the requirement for BNG. So the toolkit is a way of like counteracting that. And of course, as everybody will have, extremely high housing targets and demand for that offsite BNG units. So that was where we thought about repurposing some of our council land. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we've done a BNG baseline report and strategy with Atkins, where we've used our local plan data to BNG baseline assess 69 council-owned sites. So these are open spaces, sites that are over a hectare within our boundary. The little photograph there is sort of an example of one of those. That equates to 450 hectares of potential land for BNG and SuDS. So we've baseline assessed those based on our habitat type condition score, whether it was a priority habitat or not, the statutory designations and strategic significance. And we've shown that BNG potential as a RAG rating, a red, amber, green. So if you can just click on to the next, there's just 2 maps. So this is your typical map. Oh, yeah, typical map, which just shows your RAG rating in terms of the potential for BNG. So the green is where we've got the potential of over 5 units of BNG. And then the amber is 2 to 5 units of BNG per hectare. And then we didn't actually have any red. There's a reason for that. It's usually because the baseline habitats are pretty poor to start with, and so that means it's easier to provide your enhance and provide your habitat units. And then if you just click onto the next one, this is our strategic flood risk assessment mapping, which shows the higher level of detail because we've got flood risk from all sources of flooding. This just shows that integrated flood risk and shows the depths that you're looking at, with the purple being the higher depths, but we're able then to cross-check the map that shows the flood risk with our BNG RAG rating map to show us where our potential is for creating those potential natural flood management SuDS BNG projects. So if you just click on, and so this is now our toolkit. So obviously I'm not an ecologist. I've had to learn quite a lot about this in the last few years. But my sort of background is as an engineer in the flooding world. So we worked on this toolkit to really try and show us what actually we needed to do if we were going to, and it's going back to all of the previous presentations we've had. It's a lot of that research and a lot of that expertise, but put in then into the design of these SuDS. So this was a swale that I did about 10 years ago. This was 10 years ago when we did it, but you can see a typical urban green space. It's that amenity grassland. It's cut to within an inch of its life. Whilst it might be green, it has very little ecological benefit. And this is very typical of the type of green space that we have in Hull and where we might want to retrofit our SuDS. But at present, it's what it's called under the UK habitat classification, modified grassland, and its condition would be moderate because there's very few species there. So if you could just click on. So this was the toolkit showing us what the enhancements would be in that sort of typical area. So this is not just for swales, I'm just using swales as an example, but also for detention basins, filter strips, or what we call green embankments, which are bunds. So it goes from the standard SuDS design, which is where you would create your SuDS and probably just replant it with your amenity grass seed, to your enhanced SuDS design, which was actually just planting that with other neutral grassland. So that's your wildflower seed mixes and your sedgy grasses, and trying to keep it in that moderate or good condition, which is that sounds like it should be easy, but it really isn't, because that involves a lot of the work with the community and ensuring that a lot of those urban issues that we have around vandalism, around fly grazing, around fly tipping, dog walking and things, that we just make sure that we work with people to understand that they need to work with us on these because it's habitat. It's using species-rich grassland seed mix, ideally of a local provenance. So Hull, prior to being built as a city, would have been a delta, would have been marshland. So it's finding sort of that local grass that we still have where we can and using that as our seed mix. So it's about making seed banks as well so that we can do that. As it's been said also before, the key is about a completely different change in how we maintain these. So rather than our grounds team jumping on a triple mower and mowing it every month, it's about just mowing it twice a year, and the arisings being collected and disposed of, because one of the issues that we have with our neutral grassland is we have quite rich soil in Hull. It's very heavy clay, and that actually then doesn't help with what we're trying to do in terms of our habitat creation. So if you can just flick on. And then the other things that we need to consider when we're creating that vegetated SuDS, so your management commitment, so it's got to be secured for at least 30 years, so we have to think about that. And I'll be honest, the reason we did the toolkit in the first place, because we were looking at, can we create an income that helps us manage and maintain our SuDS features? So it was very much about, well, actually, if it's Biodiversity Net Gain and we're selling those units to a developer as his offsite units, then we're also able to get that commuted sum through Section 106 that helps manage that SuDS feature. Now, there'll be bits of the SuDS feature that obviously for the flood risk, such as the head wall and the sort of grey parts of that, which would still have to be maintained by the flood team. But if the grounds team are then getting that 30-year income, then it helps convince them to work with us on this and to adopt and maintain. Slopes, as we've discussed already, so for the types of equipment that we've bought as Hull City Council to enable us to maintain these, it's a 1 in 6 side slope so that we can get in to do the cutting and we can do the collecting. Very much about that cutting disposal. I found out we didn't actually have a composting facility in the city, so obviously there's an issue there with actually cutting that vegetation and then having to take all those cuttings off site. Pollution sources, so you're very much thinking about if it's next to busy roads, then they're going to be spread with salt. There's going to be that pollution risk from cars and things. So thinking about your species that you need to consider on there, and also your water levels. Will it be regularly wet or dry? Because that's going to influence your species. Soil type, which is a big thing in terms of what pH your soils are. Erosion. So when you're designing your SuDS, thinking about is it going to be fast flowing water? Are they going to wash away the plants before they're well established? Could that actually then block the outfalls and inlets? And of course, being climate resilience, because we're going to get more extreme weather events. So we need to have a real think about the species that we do here. So next slide, please. And of course, there are other habitat types as well that are in the matrix, which you could consider. We didn't look at those specifically in the toolkit because we didn't feel that there was much in terms of enhancement. But of course, there are reed beds, there's wet woodland, there's ponds. So some thoughts about actually when you're doing those, and I think that links back to the last 3 presentations that have just been shown. So that's actually brilliant. But how you can just think about your planting in those to get you to that good condition, which is then helping you with your BNG. And if you could flick on. So the conclusion from the works that we've been doing is definitely SuDS can be used to deliver SuDS BNG in your urban areas. The key to this being collaboration. So instead of working in silos and somebody designing this all at different times and then it being passed to your specialist, bringing everybody together. So ecologists, your SuDS specialists, your landscape architects, because all of those enhancements that I've just gone through, that sort of requires that different level of expertise. I hadn't a clue about plants or any of this before we sort of started looking at this. And so now it's very much about understanding that vegetation, site selection. So if this is for your retrofit, but even if you're sort of sequentially testing your site in terms of development, then if somebody's got a site and it's got existing really valuable habitat, then the whole idea of BNG is ideally do not touch that and do your development in that lower area of habitat on that site. So that's where your distinctiveness comes in. Community, I can't stress enough how important they are in terms of really being whether this is successful or not, because we really struggle in terms of managing and maintaining the ecology and the habitat if it's not accepted by community. And whilst everybody says they really want ecology and they want habitat and they want wildlife, when they actually realise that doesn't mean a piece of mown land that's mown within an inch of its life, they get really upset about it. And I'll move on to the last slide just after this one and give you an example. And then you've got long-term management, and that you must ensure that that's secured for 30 years. But I think that's something that we can really use to help us with our SuDS, because key of this, if you can just flick on, please, Charlotte, to the last one. So this is just an example of one of the BNG SuDS sites we've done. So this is Primrose Drive in Derringham in Hull. It's a piece of existing green space behind people's houses, which is always unfortunate because I think when they're behind people's houses, it tends to mean that there's a lack of ownership. So we had a lot of issues with litter, fly tipping, antisocial behaviour on this green space. What we've done is just created a basin. But rather than plant it back with the amenity grassland, it's planted back with wildflower seed mix. And we put the staples around there, and it's also been planted. There's a hedge around the outside of this as well. But when we first finished this, there was some key lessons to us as a Living with Water partnership. One was don't show people pictures of vegetated solutions, how they're probably going to look in about a year or two's time. vegetated solutions and SuDS will always take some time to establish. So people expected it to look exactly like we'd shown it to look on the visuals, which of course was very attractive with lots of wildflowers. And it takes some time. It's going to take some time to establish. This was it after about 6 months. It looks different every season. But I had to face a baying mob in the community who were like wanting my guts, basically, because this they thought looked a mess. They didn't like it. There was weeds. They couldn't get in. And when I had to stand there and the butterflies came out in force to support me, to say, this isn't for you. We don't want you going anywhere near this. This is a SuDS feature, which is going to hold water, and it's also for ecology and habitat. And what that means is we don't want humans tramping around. So whilst the planting is not really friendly for people walking around it, we did actually put paths around the outside, and what you can't see is there's another green space next to this which we've retained as amenity grassland, which is where we want, which has got the bins and the benches, which is where we want people to sit. But ideally we want them just to sit and appreciate this and not be walking all around it. But it's taken quite a bit of time to convince people that this has been designed with a purpose, rather than it just be the lazy council can't be bothered to maintain it, so they've just created these areas so that it gets them away from maintenance. So yes, I'll end on that note. But yes, it's definitely, you can do it, and I would advise everybody to try their hardest, because I think it's a really good way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. A great presentation. As always, really good to hear the opportunities and challenges from actual implementation of not only SuDS, but most importantly, the biodiversity elements of SuDS. Can I have all the speakers on screen, please? So we are running a little bit behind in terms of the Q&A. So it's going to be cut short, I'm afraid. But the good thing is, thank you so much to Craig for answering some of the questions already in the Q&A. So I will not repeat those. They were really good questions, though. So I invite you to head over to the Q&A and type on the answered questions. You can read those, really good ones. Now, if we head on to the ones that haven't been answered so far, let's start from the top. And the first one is about I think it's a reflection on Craig's presentation, but I do believe that also reflects some of Rachel's points. So shocking examples of bad SuDS for invertebrates, not surprised after reading the findings of the Lost Nature report by Wild Justice, where 100% of invertebrate boxes that were put down as enhancements in planning applications were absent, and 59% of wildflower grassland were damaged. And I guess the question here is about the enforcement and how can we try to make sure that those planning requirements are actually put in place. But I would say most importantly that they are understood and also that they are maintained. So can I have a dual response from Craig and Rachel, please?
Yeah, I'll kick off. So yeah, absolutely. The promises given in planning applications often never come through and never materialize, and that is a big issue. Enforcement is up to the local authority, the planning authority, and they're under pressure. There's a lot of development, and they can't have eyes everywhere. So I think it is a case of being able to NGOs like BugLife, calling them out on some things and making sure that happens, but also members of the public, if they're not seeing what they expected through the planning to actually challenge that. Rachel's probably got coming from a
yes.
local authority, probably got a better view.
Well, I sit within the local planning authority within the council, so I am well aware of that. There's no resources for enforcement, and the government don't seem to be taking any notice of anyone who asks for resources for enforcement. So for me, it's very much more about the carrot than the stick. So I think it's so you saw with my example there, the interpretation board. So it's really about helping people understand, because I think they do like it if they understand what it's for, and if they understand that there still is some maintenance. The one thing that really annoys me the most is that everyone says SuDS create litter, and we all know that SuDS don't create litter. That's horrible humans, but SuDS collect that litter. But actually, then if you can get the community to work with you to say, well, actually, rather than that litter all blowing into the gullies, which yes, it disappears, but then it's going to block your sewer and flood your house. It's visible and we can see it, and we can organise like community litter pick days and things to sort of do that. So I try and rely, because I don't think the enforcement issue is going to change. So it's very much going to be driven by people wanting this and realising the benefits of it rather than the stick, which I think is always going to be a challenge.
Thanks a lot for this. All right, the next question will be about how do we design biodiversity how can we incentivize high quality biodiverse environment habitat through the existing BNG metric? And I don't know who wants to take that on. Who's most familiar with the metric? I would imagine maybe Rachel. But sorry, Rachel, putting you on the spot.
No, it's fine. I guess it's similar. So it's sort of like trying to get people to see the value of it, so that so that developers are, rather than seeing it as something they have to do and they're forced to do, something that they want to do because it adds value onto their development. So, high quality biodiversity, ecology, and SuDS, by being able to say to people, look, you've got this in your new development, isn't that brilliant? And then buying houses and asking for that is the way I think that we incentivize it.
Thank you. And we've put a resource in the chat box earlier on, which is about getting SuDS right from the start, which has those very important points of increasing the value of a site if SuDS are implemented correctly with all the pillars, including biodiversity. Andrada, sorry.
Okay, I also just wanted to raise a point about BNG and baselining correctly from the start, and I guess the value of how we define value in these systems like SuDS. So I've mentioned in my project plant species like spear thistle and common ragwort, often labeled as undesirable with the BNG, and under the legislation like the Weeds Act. Ecologically, we know they're probably the most important for pollinators with very high nectar quantities for a wide range of pollinators. So removing them entirely can actually create that seasonal gap in resource availability for invertebrates. Of course, that approach is not now to let them dominate, but more to like allow the presence where they don't create a conflict with management. And that's often the case with SuDS. It's away from grazing. SuDS is a good context for that. So habitats shouldn't be penalized to begin with for containing species that actually have that strong functional value in the habitat, even if they carry this negative perception. That's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you so much, Andrada. All right, moving on to the next question. I think this one probably is going to be a mix for Andrada and Kirsty, but there's a question about what are probable chromium sources in the runoff ending up in those SuDS. And maybe we can, so there's a few responses here in the chat as well, but I wonder if Kirsty, Andrada, you have, if it is something that you want to respond to, and maybe if there are other type of pollutions that you'd like to highlight, that would be a good opportunity to do so.
Yeah, so as Joe has kind of responded, the road runoff is probably the primary source of the chromium. Things like vehicle tire abrasion, brake pads. There's all sorts of bits of cars that are made up of things like stainless steel, or just chromium plated that kind of get wear and tear. Tiny fragments will come off. Anything that ends up on the road gets washed off and usually straight into a SuDS system. So yeah, there's a lot of that aspect. In particular for SuDS, there's also some sources from building and kind of actual construction. So from my perspective, that's probably not a likely source because all of the SuDS I've been studying are quite a lot of the way on from their initial development, but there's definitely sources that could be coming from the actual construction process.
Thank you. Andrada.
Yeah, just to add to that as well. I mean, Kirsty already has empirical evidence of the concentrations of the heavy metals in these suds, but we don't quite understand how they flow through the food web, like how they impact plants and then pollinators and then the entire community actually. But that's why, just to really flag, that's why monitoring actually needs to be built into the life cycle of the suds, not just treated as an optional extra. So we know responsibility is shared about this with developers and designers. Like, they need to consider the potential exposure pathways in the design stage. That's ideal. While, as Craig said, local authorities and site managers should take that long-term monitoring on and maintenance as well. So if risks are identified, and there is guidance on this with thresholds, there should be actually clear mitigation options. And again, it doesn't need to be costly. It can be quite cost effective with sediment or even limiting the pollutant uptake with something as simple as plants. Like certain plants, we know they are hyperaccumulators. They can store high concentrations of heavy metals, particularly chromium, from the soil, and then they store them in a tissue, and they are not harmed by it. So cost-effective methods like that can work.
Thank you, Andrada. This is another key point that all the speakers have been hammering on today, is the really key bits around long-term maintenance. And not only just the maintenance itself, but planning for that long-term maintenance. So do you have those plant sediment traps in place, and what are you going to do with them in the long run? Who's going to take care of it? How much is going to cost? All that is front and center and should be considered early on. We only have 2 minutes for the next question. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go over all of them, but I think I'd like to combine 2 questions from the chat, and that will be for Rachel. Sorry, Rachel, are you still with us? I see your camera is off. Yeah, you're here. The first one is from Joe, and it's about the size of suds and how you can actually use small sites for BNG, so biodiversity net gain, and would small sud still score if they are small and isolated? And then, as a follow-on to that, there's a very interesting question from a participant around the legally securing the BNG habitat bank sites. So that's it.
Yes, so the legally ones, yes, you're right. It's we can't enter into a Section 1 agreement with ourselves. Our legal team are sort of working on this, but that's the beauty of the Living with Water partnership, because that means we've got East Riding, our partner authority. We're a combined authority with them now, actually, and Yorkshire Water. So we're looking at between us how we would create that habitat bank between us to get round maybe that Section 106, but it's work in progress at the moment. And in terms of the small suds, I think the small suds in the BNG lends itself quite nicely, actually. I mean, the suds that we've retrofitted aren't massive. The difficulty is registering them, because at the moment I think Natural England wants us to register them as individual features rather than like a site, which means that it gets more expensive. But again, it's sort of all work in progress and how we do that. But I feel like depending, I suppose, on what BNG you can create on that sud and what your baseline is in the first place. So if it was brownfield site and you're then creating a vegetated sud, then you've immediately got some BNG there, even if it's quite small. So it just depends on each site's going to be different, and each design's going to be different in each layout. So it probably doesn't answer your question, I'm afraid, but I definitely think there's potential there for small site suds.
Thank you so much, Rachel. All right, we are reaching the end of our Q&A. I'm going to ask the speakers if there are any remaining questions that you feel that you can type an answer to. Please feel free to do so. The Q&A is still open. But as you do so, I'd like to thank you for those very good presentations and for the overview that you gave us in terms of how SuDS and biodiversity can work hand in hand if we can overcome some of the challenges and if we consider them early on and if we keep in mind the long-term maintenance needs around those. So thank you so much for this. I am going to go to, so there is a feedback and CPD poll that is going to pop up on your screen. If you want to do a very quick answer to that, please do so. It's very useful for us to assess the quality of the events that we put together. Next slide, please, while you do so. All right. Okay, here we go. This is one last big thank you to our members from the Syria Biodiversity Committee of Practice. Your support gives us the opportunity to put together this type of event, and we hope that you do find those useful. If you would like to join the leadership group, please feel free to drop me an email, and would love to welcome you aboard. The second slide is pretty much the same, but for our SuDS Drain partners. I mean, the topic of the day was so much crossing over those two topics that, it's really thanks to you all that we were able to put those sets of speakers together and to organize this event, the recording of which will be available in the coming days. A heads up that we are opening our annual Biodiversity Awards in a couple of weeks. So 5th of May, we're going to be opening those. And there will be a series of categories where you can demonstrate how you included biodiversity within your site's existing project, delivered project, etc., etc. And of course, SuDS, that would be actually great to see SuDS as biodiversity project within those awards. A heads up on upcoming events. We are putting the finished touches on a guidance document, which will be released on the 17th of June. This is also very much relevant because this is about the long-term maintenance of blue and green assets. And this is about asset management for blue and green infrastructure. And the webinar on the 17th of June is a free one. So if you want to register to that one, please do so. It's going to be really interesting hearing from the framework that we've created to facilitate the incorporation of blue and green infrastructure into asset registries, what it means in terms of the maintenance, etc., etc. We are going to have our SuDS Awards in Newcastle on the 24th of June. And on the following day, we are organizing a urban nature walking tour. For those of you who wants to attend, please drop me a line. And lastly, I mentioned a bit before, we are organizing a microhabitats webinar, which will be all about trying to get all those bumps and small holes and all that into landscapes. So we have a variety of habitats in there. And so this will be a very interesting webinar. It's also a free one. So if you want to register to that one, please feel free to do so. And with that, I would like to give another big thank you to our speakers. It was really good to hear from your expertise and the latest in the research. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And lastly, a big thank you to all our attendees today. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to send us an email. Thanks a lot and have a great day.